Now please take your seats for the second lecture by Dr. Joe Wells.
Now, just before I get going on this second lecture, I can see its weaknesses. It's galling when you stand here and I know what I've got in my notes, and I'm wishing I'd done something slightly different. So I'm just going to flag, before I get going, I'm going to try and leave a little bit longer if we have, well, let's see how it goes, for conversation afterwards. But when it comes to tradition and innovation, how we implement is everything. And I'm going to ask you to be reflecting that question while I'm talking at a slightly more general level, so that our conversation afterwards can be more applied. Does that sound all right? And asking you to reflect about your own practice and practice that you've seen, in order, I take it, that we are keen to embody a traditioned innovation in our practice, wherever we're coming from. Okay, thank you. A couple of months ago, I was listening to the Today programme in the shower, as one does, which was discussing the case of Carol Howard and her ill treatment at the hands of, as an employee of the London Metropolitan Police, in a situation of possible racism. And at the end of the interview, John Simpson, in his sort of declaratory mode, ended by saying, "The problem, isn't it, is institutionalized racism." Now, I'm not talking about racism. My interest is in the word institutionalized. I wonder what that infers. Certainly a very negative view of institutions. I think it assumes an irredeemability about institutional life, that there's only one direction in which institutions travel, and that is in the direction of decay, of stultification, of decline. I think it assumes, too, something about corporate culture, which is to say that when we work together, there's something goes on that is somehow worse than individual personality. There's a corporate personality that develops that makes us, in a group mode, entrenched, lack responsibility, find ourselves paralyzed in regard to change, perhaps become inert and opaque and unaccountable, and in the end, compromised such that we suppress the truth. Now, that's pretty bad news. You may remember Reinhold Niebuhr said that human beings tend to be good as individuals, but bad in groups. I'm not sure human beings do tend to be good as individuals. I don't think there's any evidence through history to suggest that for one moment. But I think we can be bad in groups in ways that are different from being bad as individuals, such that we walk away and we don't take responsibility and we throw up our hands in horror and leave it as somebody else's problem. We all know institutions that have scarred people and have systematically oppressed others. Our question is how to bring about innovation and reformation in such situations. And that is a question every day. It's not just a case of a declared institutional racism. Let me quote to you from Meg Wheatley, who is one of the sort of management gurus floating around, American, from a book she wrote in 1996 called A Simpler Way, which is, to me, one of the most depressing quotes to encapsulate what we're talking about. Most people have a desire to love their organizations. They fall in love with the identity that is trying to be expressed. They connect to the founding vision. But then we take this vital passion and we institutionalize it. We create an organization. The people who loved the purpose grow to disdain the institution that was created to fulfill it. Passion mutates into procedures, rules, and roles. So instead of purpose, we have policies. Instead of being free to create, we impose constraints that squeeze the life out of us. The organization is frozen in time. We see its dead and bloated form and resent it for what it prevents us from doing. There's enough truth in that quote to nod, but there's equally enough assumptions in that quote to make me bolt. You know, me, the institutionalized creature that I described to you at the beginning. Why do policies replace purpose? There's no fundamental reason for that. Why does the imposition of constraints prevent freedom to create? I'm sorry, I just don't buy that polarity. Actually, I would say quite the opposite. For myself, I don't know if this rings true for you, if you're invited to speak or preach somewhere, I would far rather be given a title or a text from which to create something than a blank sheet that says, oh, whatever's on your heart. I'm sorry, but what's on my heart just ain't interesting enough. Give me a topic, give me a text, something to sort of rub against and wrestle with, and, you know, that sharpens me. Even if I don't like the title you've given me, I'll redefine it, I'll make it my own. How an organization values tradition yet remains open to renewal and reformation, that's our question. It's absolutely vital for keeping our institutions healthy. Recalling what it is for, recalling what are the foundation visions and principles, for ensuring its life, for continually retuning it so that it is fit for purpose in the future. It's the difference between a nest, a bird's nest, which a good nest is all about being safe and cozy. It's created for cradling some eggs, for holding the young, for protecting the vulnerable, for providing the stable platform from which to raise the next generation of leaders. But equally at the same time, a nest is a knotty mass of dead twigs. Depending how you view it, depending how it's used, depending that it's lived in, depending that it continues to be fit for purpose, depending that from one year to the next, the bird revisits that nest and lines it again with feathers or whatever it does. Otherwise, for sure, it's a knotty mass of dead twigs. We love to hate the institutions we depend on. We malign those we view from a distance as lifeless bureaucracies. We create soap operas about the ones which are closest to home. We laugh at their dysfunction, do we not? It was so painful watching Rev, for me. Just at the point, somebody sent us Series 1. We were still living in the States, but we just made the decision to move back to England. Somebody sent us Series 1 for Christmas, and we watched it in that lovely gap between Christmas and New Year where everything's quiet. You know, we watched two episodes per night until I got to the point when I said to Sam, I can't bear this any longer. It's just too close to home. Is this really what we're looking for? There's a naivety about life in America that's quite attractive sometimes. Even if we recognize institutions as necessary, probably as necessary evils, we prefer to ignore them than serve them, to kick at them rather than to invest in them. I dare say we too readily dismiss institutional leaders, and yes, I think I'm referring to bishops and archdeacons and rural deans and senior staff, all those kind of people, probably archbishops, chaplains, and everybody working in London for sure, as either self-serving careerists or bureaucratic administrators. Come on, we all do it. We just do it of others in one place or other. I could probably sponsor a good few children through school in South Sudan if I got a penny for every time somebody wondered why I had left real ministry to go into teaching, or then left teaching to become a theological college principal, or indeed then leaving academia to become a boring chaplain. It's assumed that we've moved from solution to problem. Because, here's the bee in my bonnet today, few people care to think institutionally. We're too readily out for our own back and our own reputation rather than the corporate one, because it's so easy to rubbish the corporate one. Yet we can't escape institutions, we need them. They are the background to our minds and lives, they give shape and form to who we are, they are the secret for creating the safe space for raising the next generation in such a way that it's not entirely about me or us. It's about buying into the wisdom, the deposit of tradition laid down through the ages. So I'm going to just quote now from a book about vibrant institutions and how to sustain their meaning and purpose in our lives and in the world, on the assumption that you, as for me, we are contributors, we are the builders, we are the sustainers of any vibrancy in this institution called church. I'm quoting from a book called On Thinking Institutionally by a man called Hugh Hecklow. What we need, he says, is to change the conversation and overcome the cynicism. And he's got two main suggestions. He says that there are performance-based reasons for that cynicism. The headlines about the cover-ups in Whitehall, the racism in the London Met Police, the corruption in our own banks, the stories of child abuse in our church are plenty examples of that. Clearly, some institutions are bureaucracies of the worst sort, where public trust is betrayed and common life is undermined to a point that may be irredeemable. Unhealthy institutions are really horrible. They are so powerful. The disease seems contagious to ruin everyone within them. But bad practice is no reason to exterminate good frameworks. Much more damaging, Hecklow says, is what he calls the culture-based distrust of institutions. This is what we find in Europe writ large, that is largely absent in the US and certainly absent in South Sudan, as I was describing earlier. He says, we moderns have a culture-based distrust of institutions, both because they get in our way and also because we cannot get out of their way. In the modern mental landscape, institutional distrust goes with the territory. Is the deep distrust of institutions a modern impasse? Part of the problem is our romanticized search for personal meaning in our postmodern context places institutions in the way of our individual quests. We get bitter when we discover that institutions are so powerful we can't escape them. Now, I'd like to suggest that Christians offer a way past that kind of impasse. Christian wisdom illustrates our need for institutions to shape and form us, as well as the vulnerability of institutions and their leaders to corruption. The reality and persistence of sin, paradigmatically understood in terms of self-deception, ought to make us wary of any romantic quest for personal meaning through my own individualistic personal fulfillment. And our persistent capacity for sin points us back to the importance of institutions, revealing our need for the church, the wider body, to teach and train us, to hold us accountable, to challenge us, to limit us, to constrain us, to enable us through faithful practices and holy friendships, the place where we confess our sins and learn holiness, the place where we are corrected by authority. The point is, we can't learn that kind of thing alone. We need a community that is sustained and that is not about just me or just you. Hopefully, one that is about, above all, Jesus Christ. To appreciate how and why institutions are crucial to flourishing human lives and thriving communities, you have to view them from within. If we neglect institutional thinking, it's because we think about institutions as an observer or a critic, rather than from an interpretative standpoint of affirmation and trust. Again, quoting Hecklow, institutional thinking has to do with living committed to the ends for which the organization occurs, rather than to the organization from the outside as such. Christians are those who live within the story of the church. Without Christians, the church makes no sense at all. Equally, the church, above any other institution I can think of or have ever come across, has an eschatological telos, goal, purpose, calling, which is to say that in the end, our institution called church is not about us. It's about God. That's a way of saying, perhaps dangerously, you and I are not ultimately responsible. There's a freedom there that says, my job is to be a faithful cog in God's great machine. And if I do my bit, I trust that God will bring all the cogs to work in harmony for that end moment that we call Act 5. I'm not responsible for bringing about Act 5, God is. My job is to keep Act 4 rolling in the direction of the kingdom of heaven, in the direction of righteousness, of faithful discipleship, to keep that eschatological perspective. Now, that's not the whole story, because we do have to take responsibility. Where things go wrong, clearly we're not being a good enough cog in a good enough system. And the system may need some reshaping, some rethinking, some refounding, some recasting. But ultimately, that it's not about me is a source of freedom that ought to be the permission giving to take risks, to stick your neck out. If you lose your head, it's not the end of the world for the church. It's vital in this time of cultural turmoil, when economic challenges are troubling even strong institutions. We cannot afford any longer to be cynical, to hate our institutions. It's time to develop a robust theological imagination for them. We need to learn by God to love the institutions we need. And above all, when I'm talking about institutions, of course, I'm talking about the church. And Christians are those, surely, who have that clear end for which we live and move and have our being. We should be the ones who are well equipped to narrate the vices and virtues that are intrinsic to thinking institutionally. So, what is it that makes institutions vibrant? How do we bear tradition well, yet lightly, imaginatively, in order that our institutions continue to bear fruit to the ends for which they were founded, in order that our purposes don't get bogged down in policies? How do we ensure that our institution doesn't descend into a lifeless bureaucracy? How do we maintain vibrancy? I suggest it's about continuing to make room for Christian wisdom to be nurtured and discovered. A good parallel might be that of discerning vocation. I've done a lot of that in my time with undergraduates, with ordinands, and so forth. But you know, and I know, discerning vocation isn't something you do at one stage in your life. It's an ongoing process. My vocation is continually in need of revisiting and renewing. And that happens where relationships are developed and reconciled, where spiritual life is deepened and developed, invariably occasioned by particular institutional spaces and services. I need that renewal of wisdom all the time. Perhaps you're better than I am. I leak, so to speak. Okay, 3 features of vibrant institutions. One is completely obvious. They love the tradition that birthed them, and they keep talking about it. So, speaking in this cathedral, whether that means in voicing the meaning behind the architecture, explaining how these stones speak, which may not be obvious in a modern culture that does not normally build Gothic buildings, or Norman buildings, or any other kind of. Perhaps it's in explaining our daily timetable, why my day is dictated, is shaped, exists around 3 offices, in my case. Maybe it's in explaining the formal and informal norms of the people who work and pray in one place. Maybe it's in the staff positions and their job titles that are sustained. Maybe it's in the way we make decisions in our particular organisation. Maybe it's the way you chair a PCC meeting that differs from the way other meetings are chaired. That's most obvious in monastic communities, but it's also true in schools and congregations and hospices or theological colleges. We should bear no apology for the framework, the givens, the twigs of the nest in which we seek to raise the young. Okay, so vibrant institutions love their tradition and continue to articulate it. Secondly, vibrant institutions nurture innovation. Traditioned innovation, of course. Innovation as a way of thinking and acting. I wonder how you do this in your ministry with your sheep. It's the practice of ongoing learning, of critical reflection, of giving permission to the exercise of imagination. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, says Paul in Romans 12. For there to be innovation, there has to be a focus on the future. There has to be an expectation of change as the norm. We need to be seen to be a learning organisation, a flexible, discerning, evolving community, if the future is to be as faithful as the past. That's not pitting traditionalism over against newness. It's not about a romanticised community over against a sterile bureaucracy. It's about how we are continually conformed by the Spirit to Christ, how we ever continue to unlearn sin and learn faithfulness. It's about your disciples, your sheep, your parishioners, seeing how you are growing and learning and thinking and changing as a Christian. How you welcome challenge from them, just as you seek to bring challenge to them. I've spent a lot of time in theological education, as you know, and I reflect upon one particular student. Her name was Grace, who was a very good student in theological college. I don't think I wrote it, somebody else was her tutor, gave her a lovely final year report and all that. But she had an immensely challenging curacy in a way that one could never have predicted. And what happened was, sure enough, her incumbent left after a little while, and it was a situation of conflict. Soon after he'd left, she was not only holding the baby, she was functioning in a parish where there'd been a racially inspired murder of horrible proportions and divisive consequence within her patch. And I kept in touch with her, and really we sort of, I suppose I mentored her. We prayed together, and she came crying on my shoulder a fair bit in the aftermath. Now, a couple of years after that horrendous situation, I said to her, "We never properly prepared you for this, did we? Your theological education surely didn't serve you very well." And even amidst her brokenness, she said back to me, "You know, it did. You gave me the classic pillars from which you gave me permission to use my imagination and join some new dots together." She said, "You equipped my theological imagination." I've just never forgot that phrase. So that she described herself improvising from what she'd learnt. I mean, no education can prepare you for ministry exhaustively, can it? Comprehensively. But it can give you, I think, the ingredients from which to make a whole pile of different recipes according to the circumstances and the needs. And in that situation, she had the equipment from which to improvise. I suspect we've all got that equipment, but we don't freely take the risks. Either we don't feel clever enough, or we don't remember enough, or we worry about what someone over us will think. Of course, faced with a murder, you just have to get on with it, don't you? And that was her gift. Okay, vibrant institutions love the tradition. They nurture innovation. I'm interested to know how you think you do that. And thirdly, the other vital, according to Hecklow, is they serve as incubators of leadership. That is to say, with that mass of dead twigs, you are using those twigs usefully for the next generation. That is, the institution is seeking a dynamic internal culture which attends to the diversity of gifts that walk through the doors, nurturing the variety of virtues and skills and perspectives that make transformative leadership possible. Now, not all the participants in your nest will have the gifts for transformative leadership, but all will play indispensable roles in the overall vibrancy of an institution's leadership. That's the process by which an organisation becomes more than the sum of its parts. We've already seen how the opposite, of course, is possible too, whereby a toxic organisation can take even the best leadership capacities and turn them into frustrated foul play. We must be incubators of leadership, which is to say we as leaders must be open to those strange voices and seek to be transformed by them and transform others. There's one thing I want to say about vibrant institutions, sparked by my experience of Duke University. Vibrant institutions are not always born in vibrant times. I can hear you imagining, well, Joe just doesn't know how tough it is in my patch. And I just want to say to you, toughness is no excuse for the absence of innovation. Indeed, scarcity, wilderness, toughness can be the boot camp that enables innovation in a way that in comfortable times we don't have the challenge to think about how we should change. Whenever we recognize that institutions are crucial spaces for nurturing, faithful and joy-filled living, we will be those taking the risks to found new things, to care for new practices and commitments that in turn enable continuing birth and rebirth over time. I want to put it to you, what are institutions for? I've already given you one answer, therefore protecting and passing on wisdom like we pass a baton from one relay runner to another. But there's another answer. I think institutions are for generating creativity. Institutions have the structure to provide the safety, the safe place for doing risky things. Peter Drucker, who was consultant for General Motors during World War II, when it was integral to the phenomenal organization of human effort that allowed the US to meet the needs of both the US and the Allied forces. So in 1944, at the peak of their production, when Drucker was working with General Motors, they were producing 290 aircraft every day. That's 12 per hour, 24/7. In 1 week, they produced more planes than had existed in the entire Army Corps before the war started. That's called generating creativity. That's called bringing to birth continually what is new. What was Drucker's answer to how he did it? He said, most of us fail to understand that modern production is not based on raw materials or gadgets, but on principles of organization. Organization not of machines, but of human beings. Folks, our institution is rich in that resource. We are full of human beings. We have to organize them well in order to enable creativity. And I put it to you that that doesn't take the sorts of resources that we're normally crying after. It doesn't take money to organize people well, for the most part. It takes good leadership. Ants have colonies, bees have hives. Human beings have institutions. How do we work well together? So our church, in a sense, is about organizing people well for effective productivity, if you'll excuse that instrumental picture. Our productivity is about living and witnessing to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Latin root for institution, instituto, is to set up, to begin, to arrange, to order. So theologically, it's not just about our common ends, our eschatological telos, it's about our generativity. It's about how we organize the pieces, the people, for newness. Otherwise, we have done little more than define a bureaucracy. Institutions, at their best, are the definitive expression of what it means to be human. Their purpose isn't simply to organize our efforts or to aim us at an end, but through both to generate our creativity, to generate our interrelationships with each other towards that end, and in so doing to allow us to attain our purpose as human beings who are created in the image of God and who exist with our own creative potential for the glory of God. So we move from the nest to nurture. And I want to describe to you a case study I came across from the Harvard Business Review of the movie studio Pixar, to illustrate something of the role of generative creativity for a vibrant, innovative institution. The founder and president, Ed Catmull, wrote that Pixar has enjoyed unprecedented success. 9 blockbuster films in 14 years. And he says that's not the result of luck, nor is it the result of hiring talented people. It's the result of adherence to a set of principles and practices for managing the creative talent and encouraging risk. Catmull notes that Pixar executives have to resist their natural tendency to avoid or minimize risk. Yes, even in California, even in the film industry, which he says is much easier said than done. In the movie business and in plenty of others, this instinct leads executives to choose to copy their successes rather than to try something brand new. So they've produced one great movie, they want to do the same thing again. That doesn't work in the movie industry. Management's job is not, therefore, to prevent risk, but to build the capacity to recover when failures occur. I think there's a good role description for anyone leading people here, by the way. Most particularly, perhaps, a bishop. The management job is not to prevent risk, but to build the capacity to recover when failures occur. In other words, to encourage risk. The particular bishop that I work for is quite strong on this, as you probably know. Catmull goes on to note that the capacity for recovering from failure rests on talented people who are willing to learn from their mistakes. It's not about hiring talent, again. He says it's about banking it and nurturing it. So the challenge, he says, is about getting talented people to work effectively with each other. That takes trust, it takes respect, which we as managers can't mandate. It must be earned over time. What we can do, he says, is construct an environment that nurtures trusting and respectful relationship and unleashes everyone's creativity. If we get that right, the result is a vibrant community where talented people are loyal to one another, and their collective work, everyone feels that they are part of something extraordinary, and their passion and accomplishments make the community a magnet for other talented people coming out of schools or working at other places. Note that the goal of constructing a supportive environment is to unleash everyone's creativity. Constructing a supportive environment, that's more than a metaphor. That touches not just on a culture of nurture, but on how the nest itself is laid out and functions. Catmull in particular talks about creating spaces where people encounter each other face to face, so they're not just shooting emails to each other. He talks about the importance of where the water fountain is, Okay, that's California. We can talk about where the kettle is, where the coffee pot is, perhaps. There needs to be encouragement to cross paths and to hang out together, so those spontaneous conversations that cannot be planned or predicted happen. There need to be ways in which relationships are built that get around our electronic age of, the convenience of emailing and tweeting and Facebook and so on, because the creative conversations rely on face-to-face interrelationship and trust. Most buildings, he says, are designed for some functional purpose, but ours is structured to maximize inadvertent encounters. Particularly in creative endeavors, he says, barriers between disciplines are impediments to producing great work. Therefore, we must do everything we can to tear them down. This speaks to me of the way Archbishop Justin has reshaped the environment of Lambeth Palace. You might be interested. In former times, there were areas of specialism. There was an advisor for interfaith, an advisor for ecumenism, an advisor for, I'm drawing a blank, other such areas. What Archbishop Justin has done is said, no, I'm not doing it like that. He's split the staff into 3 areas, his 3 archiepiscopal priorities. You probably know what they are: the renewal of prayer and religious life, we've already touched on, reconciliation inside and beyond the church, and evangelism and witness. And everything falls under those 3 headings. That's the sort of operating system, the lens through which everything works. So an approach from Chemin Neuf, the community that are currently resident at Lambeth, that's ecumenical. It's also about prayer and religious life. It's also about evangelism and witness. So he says, we're not putting things in the same boxes anymore. We're not functioning in silos. He wants overlap between different members of staff. Another thing he suggested that I have to confess people like me recoiled at was, if any of you know Lambeth Palace, you'll know that there's a conference room in one end of the corridor that's had a huge oval table in it that I think was created when the Archbishop's Council began. It's a sort of boardroom table that apparently, a sort of oval boardroom table that apparently is very, very like one at number 10 Downing Street, though I've never been in there. Archbishop Justin had it dismantled straight away. He said, no, it's just not flexible enough. It's great to work around a table, but let's put tables up and down, and then we can have small groups, we can do this, that, and the other. So that poor table, and whoever donated it, it's now in a storage room, deconstructed, but not given away at this point. He also suggested that the senior leadership team at Lambeth should share one office, open plan. In fact, he wanted us to use the conference room at one point. Now, I'm an extrovert. I love, those conversations that happen at the water fountain. But the idea of sharing an office with 8 or 10 people and hearing their phone conversations and them hearing mine, I just thought, I'll never be able to concentrate. Just, I'll be dying to go home at the end of each day and just hide myself in a box with the door closed. And I'm an extrovert. I have to say I'm a bit thankful at the moment to say that the other staff reacted the same way. So at the moment, the Archbishop has not got his way on that. I'm sure there are very good arguments for open plan offices, and of course what he's trying to create is that Pixar water fountain notion more naturally, so that we're not operating silos, so that we are aware what each other is doing, so that there is trust. And of course, if there isn't trust, it's highlighted immediately in situations like that. So we're dashing in and out of each other's offices. It's a bit like West Wing, if you've ever watched that. And that's how it works at the moment. I'm just tempted to say one more thing about Archbishop Justin. He keeps saying to us when we have staff meetings, he says, I don't want this to get too comfortable. You're all a very nice bunch of people, and I don't want you to agree with each other. In other words, he's trying to stir us up so that there is the room to take risks. There is the room to say, no, I disagree with that, and fight back. Now, to create that kind of culture in a PCC or in a boardroom or in an executive council, whatever it is, actually takes ongoing work, because we are instinctively risk-averse, are we not? So if everybody seems to be going in that direction, I'm likely to say, oh, well, forget what I was going to say. And what Archbishop Justin is saying to us all the time is, no, speak up. Do it quickly. Don't waste time. But let's hear it, and then let's fight about it. Fight about it in love. You know, he loves good disagreement, as you know. How to create that? Okay. I think that's enough on Pixar. Let me jump to a few principles from Acts of the Apostles, at which point I'm going to stop. I think Acts is a particularly suitable scriptural source for working out what thriving, generative communities look like. It's the only biblical text that narrates the formation of Christian communities in their earliest days. So, I suggest it corresponds to the theological shape of God's work in establishing communities that were meant to thrive. 6 features for a pattern of life in thriving communities, which I don't intend so much as a to-do list, but as a picture of what the church needs to continue being the church. Number 1, you're not going to like this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, networking. By which I mean there's a remarkable level of interconnection between the various Christian communities in the urban ports and cities of the Roman Empire, in terms of both personnel and the interchange between them, and the communication by letter and messenger. The Jerusalem Council assumes its letter will reach all the Christian communities scattered around the Mediterranean rim. The book of Acts makes concrete and intelligible the numerous greetings and personal instructions in Paul's letters. That network was not about some disingenuous schmoozing, as the word networking has often become associated. It was about establishing solid relationships. And by the way, for establishing solid relationships, the coffee hour won't do. Nor will Facebook, nor will tweeting, nor will email. There's got to be, in my conviction, there's absolutely got to be face-to-face, incarnational contact between us for trust to develop. Because without that face-to-face, you won't risk, you won't argue, you won't work things out together in a mutual appreciation. Number 2, there needs to be visibility. Christian was a term coined by outsiders. To be Christian was to belong to a group whose life was publicly visible, which is to say, believing was not a private matter but involves witness to something beyond the self. It might be uncomfortable, but we must say a thriving community has a public nature. That includes a turning away from internal matters from the self. We have to help one another with that. That's where the trusting, networking web of relationships is crucial. That's where clergy getting together is important. Your parishioners are probably not going to have the courage to tell you to turn away from internal matters from yourself, because they're preoccupied with them too. At least in Acts, the public nature is a force for cultural destabilization in the wider Mediterranean world. It's stirring things up. Number 3, in Acts there's always provision for the weak. Thriving can evoke images of health and strength and independence and vitality, as if weakness and sickness and dependence is excluded. In Acts, thriving includes provision for and inclusion of the weak and the downtrodden, not as an add-on to the central mission of the church, but as something integral and internal to it. The first threat to the community occurs when the Hellenists complain against the Hebrews because the Hebrews are neglecting the Greek-speaking widows in the daily distribution of food. Acts devotes only a few verses to that controversy, but we know it seriously threatened the church because all 12 apostles appear on the scene to fix it, to create a new authority structure of deacons, to provide a lasting structure to deal with provision for the weak. Contact with the poor is not something we do for their sake, though I hope it does benefit them. It is also about meeting Jesus. It is fundamental to who we are, and therefore to our renewal. Number 4, the processing of disagreement and conflict. Thriving does not exclude disagreement and conflict. Instead, it acknowledges it and it incorporates it back into the life of the community. Of course, best known conflict in Acts is the Jerusalem Council of chapter 15, whether or not the Gentiles had to be circumcised. Now, that's a tectonic theological issue, threatening unity at its very core. It makes our current hot-button issues small, I suggest, in comparison. We need to hold on to that perspective. Number 5, the articulating of belief. There's a prevalence of speeches in Acts which address the ultimate reason as to why the community exists. Think Peter, most of all. The speeches that are addressed both to outsiders who challenge it or are curious, and to insiders for embracing their new identity in mission. Belief is articulated at every opportunity. Final thing, suffering. Typically, as I've said, we don't associate suffering with thriving. But in Acts, the thriving communities suffer from start to finish. Acts instructs us to be suspicious of our tendency to think that if we develop thriving communities, we will be liked, we will be rewarded for our work, we will draw others en masse. No, rather, to thrive in a Christian sense is also to provoke, to remind the world both of its brokenness and its hope, to run the risk of being an offense to the world, in order that we relearn and discern and embrace continually the glory that is God. Amen.
Thank you so much, Joe. Now we've got time, I think, for just one question. No? Yes? Yes, over there. Archdeacon Paul.
Paul Thomas, Archdeacon Salop. In your discussion of the relationship between individual and the corporate life of the church, I was listening out for the word conscience and I didn't hear it. What does one do when one's conscience clashes with the corporate mind of the church? How does one resolve it? How does one go forward?
I think one is, first of all, honest about it, willing to voice it, which might mean being willing to be unpopular, might mean risking being misheard and misunderstood. Equally, I think one is challenged by the majority and understands that one's conscience is continually held to account by others and therefore subject to review and ever provisional. That's true for all of us. Thirdly, I think we seek to find some like-minded people, where we can keep thinking and learning and talking freely that is not dangerous, as well as maintaining contact. I mean, we don't have a good, healthy, thriving community of disagreement without the voicing of individual conscience, particularly when it runs against the grain. And I think, lastly, one stays within the body, however uncomfortable that is, so long as you understand the institution to be beyond, how do I say this, beyond the John Simpson irredeemable. And I think in the case of the church, it is God's church. So I'm not sure there's ever a situation where we depart from our brothers and sisters because we disagree, I'm assuming, that creedally we are held together by what really matters.
One more.
In fulfilling and revealing the full meaning of the Old Testament traditions about sacrifice, the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus resulted in the abandonment of so many of the outward expressions of that tradition. I wonder, do you think that maybe in the church sometimes we have a difficulty in distinguishing between the tradition that needs to be passed on and the outward forms of the expression of that tradition?
Certainly I do. That kind of discernment lies behind everything I've been seeking to address this morning. And I would agree with what I assume to be the premise of your question, which is that discernment is often contested. It is difficult. We have to, that's why we have to recognize we have an eschatological purpose. The purpose doesn't change, the telos. And what does change in the review of tradition is to reshape the practices in order that the telos is met. That doesn't change from Old Testament to New Testament in terms of sacrifice. But how we observe that telos it is negotiable.
Thank you so much, Joe. Towards the start, you let us in very lightly and very gently, and then increasingly you've turned the ratchet and become more demanding. And we've benefited from that. You've stretched us enormously. And during the coffee break, it was interesting to interrupt groups saying things like, we've got several nuggets to take away. I want to study some more theology, one person was saying, and so on. So you've stretched us in more than one way and given us a lot to think about as we continue to operate in an institution like this, longing for innovation and longing for God's Spirit. So may I ask you to express your appreciation of Joe.